The RTB01 Space Marine. It's iconic, it helped give Warhammer 40,000 its identity, and elements from it are frequently homaged in modern models. Let's take a probably too long look at them, shall we?
Greetings Retweet boys and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Underground, overground, wombling free, the wombles of the Imperium of Man's Adeptus Astartes are we. Today we shall be talking about the first multi-part Space Marine kit, often referred to as the RTB01. Now, we have talked about it before in this series as part of our retrospective on old Marine models, but we felt like this classic kit deserved some special treatment. Plus that video is getting kind of old, and talking about them in more detail gives us a springboard to talk about some other stuff too.
Back in the early 1980s, the miniatures used in tabletop games were generally metal, usually metal containing some amount of lead since it's easy to work with. Although the metal itself was a more expensive material than, say, plastic, making minis out of metal was more suited to smaller operations as the molds and infrastructure required was vastly smaller and cheaper. Still, this meant that these minis weren't really meant to be handled by kids since they were, on some level, toxic. Insert joke about not licking lead minis here. In fact, from what we've gathered from people around at the time, it was not uncommon for tabletop gamers to view minis made of plastic as being children's toys rather than their proper, more detailed metal adult miniatures. You don't understand, okay? This man, who is also a lizard, is actually a very mature thing to own. Because he's made of metal. Given that perception, Games Workshop and their miniature production wing, Citadel Miniatures, were pretty instrumental in changing that perception over the years, gradually moving more and more of their product lines over to increasingly high-detailed plastic, with mostly only the very old or niche products in their range being made of anything else in the present day.
Citadel's path to producing plastic kits started with the introduction of plastic slotter bases, removing the need for minis to have pudding bases built into them, and in doing so increasing the lifespan of the rubber molds used to make the metal minis themselves. Citadel founder Brian Ansell reportedly wanted to try and make the whole Citadel line out of plastic in the 80s, but the cost of the metal molds required for such an undertaking would have been prohibitively expensive unless the minis were manufactured in quantities much larger than could be justified. However, by chance, Brian would meet a man named John Thornthwaite at a trade show who said that he could manufacture some plastic miniatures at a reasonable price. And this led to the first line of plastic Citadel miniatures, a line based on the Fighting Fantasy series of books by GW founders Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson. One of these days we should cover Fighting Fantasy, if for no other reason than to point out that some of the books are written by the other American Steve Jackson, so there's pages in here where it says the name Steve Jackson twice, and you're just supposed to know that's two different people.
Released in 1985, the Fighting Fantasy minis, like this fearless dwarf here, had interchangeable parts. Their shields came with a sticker pre-applied, and to our eyes, the amount of detail they have on them isn't too shabby considering the time period. However, according to Ian Livingstone in the book Dice Men, which is once again where we've gotten a bunch of this information from, these minis did not sell particularly well, and they weren't very happy with them. They often didn't look much like the things they were supposed to represent. The poses weren't varied, the plastic they were made out of didn't take paint very well, and the minis were pretty large at around 6 centimeters tall, so weren't in scale with much else, as other Citadel minis were about half that. Although there was an article suggesting they could be used as various types of giant in early Warhammer. Which does certainly get around the scale issue, so can't fault them there. I'll be honest, the stickers on these things probably didn't help the plastic miniatures are actually for children attitude. If you didn't know what this was, I honestly wouldn't blame you for thinking that we bought a pack of 5 of these at Poundland.
However, this shaky start didn't stop them from pursuing plastic minis further, and, learning from their experience, they released the first plastic Warhammer mini, the Psycho Styrene Dwarf, later in 1985. The styrene part coming from the type of plastic it was, and the Psycho part coming from the fact it was Games Workshop in the mid-80s. These were sold in packs of 3 for 75p, each with 3 options for heads and a few weapons. These were primitive by today's standards, sure, but the extra parts meant that there was a bunch of possible variations you could make from the same sprue, something not really viable with metal models. The dwarves were followed by the drastic plastic orcs, That's 2 Ks in there, and none of them in the word orc. They were pretty much the exact same deal as the dwarves, just, you know, orcs. Having nailed down the process, these minis were seemingly much more successful than the Fighting Fantasy range, and Citadel started putting out whole boxes of plastic minis, like the Skeleton Horde, the Fantasy Regiments box, and, once Warhammer 40,000 rolled around, the RTB01 Imperial Space Marine box.
Released in the September of 1987, this was the first box set for Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, hence the RTB01 name. And why, after all these years, I still can't stop thinking of them as retweet boys. Although Beakies or Wombles are also acceptable nicknames on account of their cute little snoots. These boxes contained 30 Marines each and cost £9.99, which is just shy of 28 quid in today's money, although you could buy the individual sprues for 60p. The box was adorned with the same John Sibbick art that was on the main rulebook, which pretty perfectly set the tone for basically all of 40k right out of the gate. It also shows off one of the more charming traits of this era of GW boxes, the very extra logos they'd make for each release. Although one thing we only just noticed is the, creative descriptions on the back of the box for what each part is. The holstered bolt pistol being labelled as a needle gun, the power pack being labelled as a jetpack, the power glove being a power arm, and this thing being labelled as an ammo pack when it's clearly, okay, I actually don't know what that is, but given how other models hold on to it, I don't think it's supposed to be ammo. I mean, it's like a communicator or something.
Designed by Jez Goodwin, Ali Morrison and Bob Naismith, the overall look of these Beakies was a refinement on Naismith's earlier LE2 and C100 Space Marines, simplifying details and bulking them out in a lot of ways that would become hallmarks of Space Marine design over the coming decades, like the flared leg armour and the backpack sitting high enough to be viewed over the pauldrons, things they also shared with the RT1 metal range of Marines released around the same time. The Marine box came with 3 different sprues: Set A that could build 2 regular dudes, Set B heavy weapons that contained the variant weaponry, and Set C close combat. That was, in all honesty, less close combat and more just a combination of the other 2. These sprues were available in a variety of plastic colours, the ones we're sure of being navy blue, green and off-white. Amusingly, this does lead to you stripping the paint off an old Marine in the modern day, only to find it equally multicoloured underneath.
The RTB01s were pretty simple in construction. Legs, torso, head, arms and a backpack all on a 25mm base, with enough play in the parts to have a surprisingly large amount of variation possible from what are mostly identical parts, with the arms using a very basic and loose ball and socket type arrangement to achieve this, which doesn't make for the best connection for gluing, I must admit. Although it should be noted that of the 2 choices of legs, only one of them looks remotely natural and both of them look like poses that would cause a lot of lower back pain if stood in for any length of time. And these squatting poses accentuate the fact that, like most models from this era, they're kind of short by today's standards. The details on the RTB01s are fairly basic compared to the contemporary Metal Marines, lacking things like the panel lines on the legs or the eyes having actual lenses in them, which means painting them is an interesting experience since they're both incredibly simple, but also sometimes you may feel the need to insinuate shapes that aren't really there purely through paint. Although that is not exactly unique to these and is just something you encounter a lot when painting old minis. At least with these, you don't have to deal with all the imperfections that can often be present in the old metal casts. Saying that, most of them do have a bit of a divot on the inside of at least one of their legs. It's sort of up to you if you want to fill those in or just live with them. It's also a little on you to try and add variation to them with how you paint them, since, as previously stated, on a sculpt level they're basically all the same. The only real variance in your basic guy being on the level of the 2 leg sculpts have different shaped arse plates.
Still, there is something special about these little guys, being both undeniably Space Marines and sort of their own thing altogether. Later versions of Mark VI Corvus armour, the retroactive name given to this type of armour once other styles started showing up, have managed to make it look cooler, I suppose, especially the recent Horus Heresy versions, but I don't know, none of them really have the same vibe as these. They're imperfect in a way that's very endearing. they're perfectly imperfect. What I'm saying is that the RTB01s are in their mid-30s and are a little bit wonky, and as someone who is also in his mid-30s and feeling a little bit wonky, I can relate. As you'd imagine, the standard Beaky was armed with a bolter, but the set came with missile launchers, flamers, bolt pistols and power gloves, which is what power fists were called at the time, as well as a handful of accessories to further customise, like bayonets and bayonets which are also chainsaws. There was also an unhelmeted head, the only variant head available at all in fact, although it was pretty vague on detail and lacked the slightly manic energy of their metal counterparts' faces. Technically it's referred to as the commander head on the back of the box, but I think we've established exactly how much stock you should put in that. And talking about the other parts, for reasons I'll never fully understand, they made it so the bolt pistol and power glove are on the same hand, so you can't make the obvious loadout of bolt pistol in one hand and power glove in the other without converting.
To be fair though, being fairly basic and made of plastic means they are very easy to convert, and the ease of converting these compared to their metal marines of the time is present all over the early material about them. From the squad of Crimson Fists they used in promotion shots having a fair few reposed hands, to the heavy conversion work seen all over the various rulebooks and White Dwarf issues, it's pretty clear that the studio team was having fun with the freedom this kit gave them, easily making up for the lack of variation in the kit itself. To be clear, it's not like it's impossible to do similar things to metal minis, but it's much more of a faff and requires more tools and know-how than the average teenager getting into wargaming for the first time was gonna have. But chopping off a plastic hand and rotating it, that is totally doable by anybody with a craft knife. You just have to avoid losing the hand instantly when you drop it on the carpet and it falls into whatever dimension guitar picks disappear into. But that's something that affects all of us, regardless of our skill level.
The prevalence of conversions in official works did translate to the player base, as demonstrated by the fact that every old set of them I've ever bought has had at least some minor conversion work done to some of them. From minor things like this reloading pose that I kept when I rebuilt and repainted him, to this hefty custom weapon made from the missile launcher that I call the Overcompensator. I'll repaint this guy someday, he's just too fun to dismantle. And I've done plenty of custom jobs myself, some more complicated than others. Whilst we're on the subject, buying RTB01 Marines now is an interesting affair in its own right. You see, there's enough of them about that they're not too expensive to get hold of in my experience, at least in the UK anyway, but they're often a little rough around the edges. One assumes they're like this because the ones you find on eBay now were usually put together and painted by an over-enthusiastic teenager in the late 80s. This is right and proper, but it does mean that they maybe weren't as careful whilst doing so as a modern collector would have liked them to be.
It should be noted though that unlike a lot of plastic minis you might get in this condition, they're pretty easy to salvage. A lot of this is down to how simple the sculpts are. Yes, this leg might be a mess, but with no other details there to worry about, you can really get in there and scrape all of the mess off and have a perfectly usable part. That's not to say that there's no such thing as an unsalvageable Beaky, the ravages of time come for us all, but these are more resilient than most. You'd be surprised how well a scruffy one can scrub up. From what we can tell, the RTB01 set was retired sometime roughly around the launch of 2nd edition 40k. Maybe? It's all a bit vague, to be honest, and the more we've asked around about it, the less sure we are of the answer. Although they did get reboxed into packs of 10 Marines around the early 90s. Regardless, they did fall back, making way for the Jez Goodwin Mark VII Marines to take their place. And as much as we like them, their retirement made sense. Between these and the many metal Marines available, the Space Marine line was a little bit all over the place in terms of aesthetics and how certain details were interpreted. Having a more unified look with the new Mark VIIs made sense, and what emerged was the same general appearance that Marines would have up until 8th edition when Primaris started to take over as the standard.
But Mark VI armour would stick around, they just wouldn't be the default option for Marines anymore, and would usually appear in plastic kits as one of many options. That is until a new edition of the Horus Heresy was launched in 2022, and the previously mentioned Beaky sculpts were the default option. Also means if you painted your 1987 Marines as a first founding chapter, then good for you, you had a Horus Heresy army ready to go. Something I could have done, but no. I had to paint them as my favourite sad boys. I guess they're also the default option in Legions Imperialis too, although being able to clearly see that requires you getting a little closer to them.
Even aside from their basic design, the legacy of the RTB01 box lives on in every multi-part plastic kit GW puts out. They weren't the first plastic Warhammer minis, they weren't even the first Space Marine minis, but for a time they were the only wholly plastic infantry minis for 40k, with subsequent plastic infantry kits like the RTB07 Imperial Guard or the RTB13 Space Orcs following a couple of years later. Those kits had much more varied designs, a greater amount of detail, and ditched the ball and socket attachment for arms, in favour of flat surfaces that allowed the parts to sit flush and let the glue do its work better. It really feels like the RTB01 set was a learning experience for Citadel, and learn from it they did.
Still, the RTB01s remain charming little lads despite their simplicity, and putting them out on the table 3.5 decades later never ceases to garner a smile.
Although that might just be a reaction to their awkward squatting poses. It's hard to tell.
Thank you, one and all, for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider doing the things we YouTubers require to feel anything, such as liking or subscribing, or maybe commenting on how much you wish not so many of the minis in this video were painted yellow. If you wish to join the names scrolling past right now, as well as getting these videos a day or so early, you can do so for as little as $1 over at patreon.com/snipeandwhip. And as a byproduct of doing so, it would mean that Snipe can buy more action figures of the Batman character Red Hood, which they tell me is more important than food, but also your support does help pay for the food as well, so I guess it's all the same thing really. Regardless, thank you, and we'll see you next time.